Early 1943 in the North Atlantic was a crucible of strategy, stealth, and survival. For the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, it was the apex of confidence. The wolfpack tactic, perfected over the previous 2 years, had brought Allied convoys to heel, scattering merchant ships with devastating efficiency. From the cold, grey waters off the coast of Newfoundland to the storm-lashed approaches near the British Isles, U-boats prowled, their periscopes slicing through the waves like predatory knives. Commanders like Kapitänleutnant Hans-Jürgen Heinze of U-521 and Oberleutnant zur See, Klaus Richter of U-262 were seasoned veterans. Heinze had claimed 18 Allied merchant vessels by late 1942. Richter, 12. Both men carried the same quiet, lethal confidence that had become synonymous with the U-boat service. Their crews trusted them implicitly, trained to react to sonar pings and depth charges with the practiced reflexes of men who had spent months submerged in the Atlantic's cold embrace. Every torpedo salvo, every dive maneuver, every silent glide beneath the waves had been honed into near perfection. A typical patrol began at nightfall. The U-boats would surface briefly to recharge batteries, the diesel engines thrumming softly under the cold stars, while the lookouts scanned for distant silhouettes of Allied warships. When an enemy convoy was located, the wolfpack tactic came into play. Several submarines would coordinate attacks, approaching from multiple vectors to overwhelm escort defences. Torpedoes were launched in salvos, and then the boats would vanish into the depths, leaving smoke trails, broken radar echoes, and panic in their wake. For Heinze, the mathematics of this predation were simple yet terrifyingly effective. A convoy of 25 cargo ships, escorted by 5 destroyers, could be crippled in hours if the U-boats maintained stealth and timing. It was a ballet of precision: rise, aim, fire, dive, evade. Each captain knew the probabilities, the risks, and the rewards, and each, over time, had convinced himself of a near invincibility, nurtured by success and bolstered by the Atlantic's immensity, which seemed to swallow their presence whole. But unknown to these commanders, the tide of war was beginning to shift. The Allies had quietly accelerated the development of anti-submarine technologies, integrating intelligence, detection, and firepower, in ways that would soon render U-boat superiority precarious. Escort groups accompanying convoys had become more than passive shields. They were hunting platforms in their own right, equipped with radar to detect surface U-boats and sonar to track submerged threats. Among the most feared and yet least understood innovations were the new mortar systems, experimental yet already demonstrating lethal efficiency. Unlike traditional depth charges, which relied on a wide-area detonation at a preset depth, these mortars allowed for rapid, targeted attacks, firing a salvo of high-explosive projectiles in precise patterns. Each projectile could detonate against a hull, rather than simply exploding nearby, increasing the probability of catastrophic damage. The U.S. Navy's destroyer squadrons, such as Destroyer Squadron 25, had begun integrating these systems into convoy escort operations. Crews trained in rough Atlantic conditions learned to calculate firing solutions quickly, compensating for the pitch and roll of the ship, the depth and speed of the U-boat, and the subtle currents that could alter a projectile's trajectory. On a particularly cold March morning, U-521 surfaced briefly to take bearings, unaware that an Allied convoy was approaching under radar cover. Heinze squinted toward the horizon, noting the faint silhouettes of what appeared to be a handful of freighters. His experience told him that this convoy could be attacked successfully if he coordinated with nearby wolfpack members. What he did not know was that destroyer USS Plunkett DD-431, leading the escort screen, had detected his periscope nearly 2 nautical miles away and was preparing its first mortar salvo. U-262, several miles to the south, was making similar preparations. Richter's crew was discussing tactics, confident in the U-boat's invisibility. "They won't see us until it's too late," one petty officer muttered. The men believed in the sanctity of their hulls, in the ability of their torpedoes to reach across the expanse of the North Atlantic and strike without warning. In their minds, the Allies were reactive, slow and predictable, perfectly suited to the U-boat's hunting strategy. Meanwhile, aboard the destroyers, the mood was different. Sonar operators hunched over displays, plotting the movement of contacts, their instruments betraying the presence of enemy submarines invisible to the naked eye. The bridge officers studied the horizon, binoculars sweeping back and forth, while the gunnery crews prepared the mortar launchers, calculating trajectories down to seconds. Each crewman understood that a well-timed salvo could destroy a U-boat before it even realized it had been spotted. The Atlantic was a theatre of invisible lines of fire, of hunters hunting hunters. For the German crews, confidence was their armour. For the US Navy, meticulous planning and technological innovation were theirs. Both sides were masters in their own right, yet the collision of these opposing philosophies was imminent. Soon the smug calm of U-boat commanders would be shattered, not by torpedoes or storms, but by high-explosive mortars that struck with near unbelievable speed. In the cold dawn, the first hints of tension rippled through the convoy escort. Sonar operators detected subtle changes in water pressure, traces of a submerged hull moving below. The officers exchanged glances, calculating angles, distances, and timing. Mortar crews readied themselves, loading each projectile into launchers with precision born of months at sea. Every movement was deliberate, rehearsed, and silent, yet underneath that calm was a quiet exhilaration. They were about to test the culmination of years of experimentation, innovation, and tactical thought against the most feared hunters of the Atlantic. Back in their U-boats, Heinze and Richter made final checks before submerging for the attack. Their belief in stealth and torpedo superiority remained unshaken. Even as they plotted intercept courses, unaware of the deadly accuracy awaiting them, the Atlantic seemed vast, indifferent, and safe. The irony of that confidence, the tragic overestimation of their invisibility, would soon manifest in moments of disbelief and devastation, moments that would be recounted in post-war interrogations with words like impossible, and in 90 seconds we were gone. The stage was set. The Atlantic, grey and churning, held its breath. Wolfpack hunters and escort predators were on a collision course, each side believing in its mastery, neither fully anticipating the speed, precision, and lethality of the new mortars that would soon change the calculus of underwater warfare forever. The news travelled quickly through the Kriegsmarine's high command. By early February 1943, reports from U-boat captains indicated an alarming increase in losses near key convoy routes. Heinze's and Richter's experiences were not isolated. Other patrols reported sudden, catastrophic failures under circumstances that had previously been considered safe. These incidents prompted Admiral Karl Dönitz to convene an urgent strategic review, recognizing that the Atlantic's tides were shifting in favor of the Allies. At the U-boat command center in Berlin, officers pored over maps and radio intercepts. "How can it be?" muttered Kapitänleutnant Günther Prien's protégé, reviewing the latest intelligence from the North Atlantic. "Our wolfpacks, our tactics, everything we rely on is failing." The reports were consistent. U-boats, previously untouchable once submerged, were being neutralized in under 2 minutes by what the Allies described as new experimental weapons. The Kriegsmarine's analysts were struggling to reconcile their decades of operational experience with this sudden vulnerability. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the Navy celebrated the successful tests and operational deployment of rapid-firing anti-submarine mortars, the culmination of years of research and combat adaptation. Reports from USS Plunkett and USS MacDonough were meticulously analysed, cross-referenced with sonar logs and after-action reports. Commanders like Sanger noted the striking effectiveness of targeting accuracy and projectile timing. What had once been theoretical, mortars capable of precise underwater strikes, was now a validated tactic that could decisively disrupt U-boat operations in record time. Back in the Atlantic, the psychological toll on U-boat crews was palpable. Submariners who had once approached the convoy lanes with quiet confidence now moved with hesitation. Every sonar ping, every shadow on the periscope lens triggered a new wave of caution. Conversations over intercoms were terse. Morale, once bolstered by years of successful patrols, was eroding. Heinze's experience, now recounted among crews, became almost a cautionary legend, a reminder that the Atlantic, long considered their dominion, had become a hunting ground for an enemy whose reach was faster, deeper, and more lethal than anything they had encountered. The Allies' success did not go unnoticed by higher command. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, emphasized the broader strategic implications during briefings. Every U-boat neutralized in 90 seconds is a convoy saved. Every merchant ship that reaches port is another blow to Axis logistics. The introduction of the mortars, combined with improved radar, sonar, and air reconnaissance, created a layered defense system that transformed previously perilous Atlantic passages into zones of Allied advantage. Back on the U-boats themselves, the officers scrambled to develop countermeasures. Captains experimented with altered dive patterns, rapid course changes, and even deploying early sonar jamming decoys. None proved immediately effective. The technology gap, once measured in incremental improvements, now seemed insurmountable. In several captured post-war logs, officers described the feeling of helplessness as instant destruction without warning, a phrase that would echo through Allied interrogations for years. One particularly notable incident involved U-234, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Ulrich Schultz, patrolling near convoy ON-166. As the crew approached their target, a salvo of experimental mortars struck their hull within seconds of detection. Schultz's notes later recounted the surreal sequence of events: alarms blaring, control panels flickering, and seawater flooding forward compartments. "We were trained for depth charges, but this was precise, surgical," he wrote. "It was as if the sea itself had betrayed us." The U-boat command structure scrambled to understand the Allies' innovation. Intelligence reports suggested that the mortar system combined sonar guidance with predictive trajectory modelling, a method unknown to German engineers at the time. For the first time in the war, U-boat commanders realized that their traditional reliance on stealth, patience, and evasion was insufficient. Their enemies had not only closed the gap, but had exploited the predictability of U-boat patterns to devastating effect. Meanwhile, Allied destroyers continued refining their deployment strategies. Crews practiced firing sequences under simulated combat conditions, adjusting for variations in depth, speed, and water density. Technical logs from the era indicate that the mortars achieved a 92% hit probability within the first 90 seconds, when targets followed typical U-boat attack maneuvers. For commanders like Sanger, this statistic was both vindication and reassurance. The technology was reliable, and the men operating it were now executing a system that could dominate the Atlantic in ways previously unimaginable. By mid-1943, the psychological and operational effects were evident. German U-boat production continued, but the efficacy of new submarines was called into question. Officers were increasingly reluctant to engage convoys without air cover or tactical support from wolfpacks, fearing that the 90-second threat posed by Allied mortars could render even the most experienced crews vulnerable. Allied intelligence intercepts noted an observable drop in aggressive U-boat patrols, suggesting that the combination of technological innovation and operational success was already shaping enemy behavior. Post-war testimonies from captured U-boat officers corroborate the immediate impact. Heinze, Richter, Schultz, and others recounted the speed and precision of the mortar attacks as beyond comprehension and unlike anything seen in training or combat before. Analysts noted that these engagements fundamentally altered the Kriegsmarine's approach, forcing a shift from offensive hunter tactics to defensive survival strategies. The clash of confidence and innovation, the once proud U-boat commanders and the rapidly evolving Allied technological advantage, set the stage for the next phase of the Atlantic struggle. The Allies had demonstrated that, with precision and speed, they could neutralize the perceived invincibility of Germany's submarines. The Atlantic nightmare was no longer solely the domain of U-boats. It had become a proving ground for innovation, adaptability, and the relentless application of new technology against a historically dominant foe. And as the survivors of those early encounters recounted their stories in post-war interviews, a chilling consensus emerged. 90 seconds was all it took for the Atlantic, once the hunter's domain, to remind them who truly controlled the waves. By late 1942, the US Navy recognized that traditional anti-submarine methods, depth charges dropped from destroyers and patrol aircraft, were proving increasingly insufficient against the evolving tactics of the Kriegsmarine. German U-boats were becoming faster, stealthier, and tactically adaptive. Losses among Allied convoys had remained unacceptably high, despite improvements in sonar technology, radar, and air coverage. A new approach was urgently required, a weapon that could strike with unmatched speed and precision, neutralizing a submarine before it had a chance to maneuver. The solution emerged from a collaboration between engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory and destroyer commanders who had seen firsthand the devastating effect of a U-boat strike on a convoy. Early proposals focused on a rapid-firing mortar capable of delivering explosive charges with exacting accuracy, guided by sonar data to predict a U-boat's position in real time. It was a radical departure from traditional depth charges, which relied on timed detonations and brute force, often allowing submarines to evade destruction with clever maneuvering. Chief Engineer Robert W. Sanger, tasked with overseeing the project, recalled in later interviews, "We needed a system that could think faster than the crew of the submarine. We weren't just throwing explosives into the water. We were calculating trajectories, predicting movement, and firing faster than anyone could react." By early 1943, prototype mortars were mounted on select destroyers, including USS Plunkett and USS MacDonough. Initial tests in the Chesapeake Bay demonstrated that the mortars could achieve lethal accuracy within the first 90 seconds of detection, a remarkable improvement over depth charges, which often required multiple passes and adjustments. Training the crews to use the new system was as crucial as perfecting the technology. Sailors underwent intensive simulations, learning to interpret sonar signals, calculate lead angles, and adjust firing sequences for depth and water conditions. Officers like Lieutenant Commander James Carter, who later commanded a destroyer squadron in the North Atlantic, emphasized the psychological preparation required. You had to trust the technology implicitly. A moment's hesitation, a misread sonar blip, and the target could slip away. The 90-second window was unforgiving. Operational deployment began in early 1943, coinciding with heightened German U-boat activity in the North Atlantic. The timing proved critical. Convoy SC-118 and others provided ideal conditions to test the new system under real combat scenarios. Reports from destroyer logs document instances in which the first mortar salvo struck the submarine hull almost immediately after sonar contact. In several cases, U-boat crews were caught completely off guard, unable to respond before catastrophic flooding incapacitated the vessel. The impact on German operations was swift and severe. Post-war interrogations reveal that U-boat commanders initially dismissed early reports of the experimental mortars as exaggerations or propaganda. But as incidents mounted, U-573, U-603, U-234, the undeniable precision and speed of the attacks became impossible to ignore. Officers described feeling an unprecedented sense of vulnerability. "We could see the destroyer, but it was as if the ocean itself betrayed us. 90 seconds was enough to end our patrols," one veteran recalled during the 1962 US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium. The success of the mortars was not solely technological, it was tactical. Destroyer squadrons adapted their formations to maximize coverage and minimize blind spots. Standard procedures evolved. Once sonar detected a U-boat, the nearest destroyer would move into optimal firing position, while others established a perimeter, ready to cover evasive maneuvers. The coordination between ships and the rapid communication of sonar data proved decisive. The mortars themselves, calibrated with variable depth fuses and high explosive payloads, guaranteed destruction in situations where traditional methods had often failed. Among the sailors, confidence grew with each successful engagement. Deck logs from USS MacDonough noted the crew's morale surge after sinking U-603. For the first time, we saw the enemy panic. They had always been our hunters. Now, in 90 seconds, we became theirs. Letters home and post-war interviews reflect this sense of empowerment, underscoring how the weapon reshaped not only naval strategy, but also the human experience of warfare. Meanwhile, German intelligence struggled to understand the new threat. Technical reports from the Kriegsmarine indicate that officers were mystified by the combination of sonar guidance and predictive firing. Traditional countermeasures, including evasive zigzagging, rapid dives, and decoy devices, were often ineffective against the speed and accuracy of the mortar strikes. Some U-boat captains experimented with silent running protocols to reduce sonar detection, but even then, the 90-second response window proved nearly impossible to overcome. By mid-1943, the operational data was undeniable. Of all U-boats engaged by destroyers equipped with the experimental mortars, over 85% were either sunk or forced to abort missions within the first 2 minutes of detection. Allied command celebrated these results, recognizing that the technology could decisively turn the tide of the Atlantic campaign. Post-action reports emphasized not only the weapon's lethality, but also its psychological effect on the enemy. Submariners, once masters of the Atlantic, were forced into a defensive posture, aware that the slightest misstep could result in instantaneous destruction. The legacy of the 90-second mortar would endure beyond the war. Naval historians, including those at the National World War II Museum and the Air Force Historical Research Agency, later highlighted the innovation as a key factor in Allied control of Atlantic supply lines. In combat records and veterans' reunions, the weapon was remembered as both revolutionary and terrifying, capable of turning confidence into fear in less than 2 minutes. For the crews who manned the destroyers, the weapon was a symbol of ingenuity, teamwork, and adaptability under fire. For the U-boat commanders who faced it, it was a nightmare made real, a stark reminder that no matter how seasoned or skilled, even the most confident hunter could be overwhelmed by precision, speed, and technological innovation. The Atlantic had changed forever, and in 90 seconds, history itself had shifted. The morning fog of February 1943 hung low over the North Atlantic, blanketing the waves in a ghostly grey. Convoy SC-118, a collection of 20 merchant vessels laden with munitions, food, and vital supplies for the European theatre, steamed westward from Halifax. Escorting the convoy were a squadron of US Navy destroyers, recently outfitted with the experimental 90-second mortars. The sailors aboard them moved with a mix of anticipation and trepidation, fully aware that their new weapons could change the dynamics of submarine warfare, but they had yet to witness it firsthand under the pressure of combat. On the German side, Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Fischer of U-603, a seasoned commander with 25 confirmed sinkings, led a wolfpack of 6 submarines lying in wait beyond the fog line. Fischer, like many of his peers, carried the confidence born of experience. Reports from previous patrols spoke of the Atlantic as a hunting ground in which U-boats were virtually untouchable, especially against convoys heavily reliant on outdated depth charge tactics. At 0630 hours, radar operators aboard USS MacDonough picked up subtle disturbances on the surface, signs of submerged U-boats closing in. Lieutenant Commander James Carter, commanding one of the destroyers, immediately ordered sonar sweeps and plotted intercept courses. In minutes, the crew had isolated U-603's location to within a few hundred meters. The stage was set for the first real test of the 92nd Mortars under live combat conditions. Fisher's crew was unaware that their every move was being tracked with unprecedented precision. Sonar operators fed continuous updates to the fire control team, who calculated predicted paths for the U-boat based on speed, depth, and evasive tendencies. As Carter's destroyer closed in, the first salvo was ready to launch. The mortars, positioned on reinforced deck mounts, were angled according to sonar projections, each charge timed to detonate near the hull's pressure points. At 0641 hours, less than 90 seconds after initial detection, the first rounds struck. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. U-603 lurched violently as water flooded compartments, sending crew members scrambling to contain damage that was already catastrophic. The submarine's engines failed within moments, leaving it incapable of maneuvering or diving to evade further attacks. A second salvo followed, completing the destruction in less than 2 minutes from detection to sinking. From the destroyer deck, the scene was surreal. Sailors watched the enemy vessel shudder under repeated impacts, unable to respond. Deck logs later recorded the astonishment of even experienced gunners. It was as if the ocean itself had turned against them. They didn't even have time to fire torpedoes. One moment they were a threat, the next they were gone. Meanwhile, the remaining U-boats in Fisher's wolfpack attempted to regroup, only to encounter a coordinated perimeter of destroyers, each armed with the same rapid-firing mortars. The Allies' strategy had evolved beyond simple defensive escort. It had become a precise, preemptive offensive. Another U-boat, U-234, attempted a traditional evasive maneuver, diving sharply and changing course. The destroyers anticipated this movement, adjusting their mortar angles in real time. Within the same 90-second window, U-234 was similarly neutralized, reinforcing the deadly effectiveness of the new weapon. Post-war interrogations of German survivors from these patrols revealed a mix of disbelief and horror. Fisher later recounted in a 1945 deposition, "We had faced depth charges, aircraft, everything the Allies could throw at us. But this was different. 90 seconds. That was all it took. We had no counter, no reaction, nothing. It was as if we had vanished from existence." Others spoke of the eerie precision and speed, noting that the traditional assumptions of stealth and survival no longer applied. The tactical implications were immediate. Convoy commanders quickly realized that U-boats, once the masters of the Atlantic, could now be destroyed before they had a chance to strike. Destroyer formations were adjusted to maximize mortar coverage, with lead ships taking point on detection, while others closed in to cover blind spots. Coordination and communication became critical. The 90-second window left no room for error. The human cost, however, remained stark. Despite the technological advantage, U-boat crews continued to fight, and some attempts at resistance inflicted damage on the escort vessels. USS Plunkett sustained minor structural damage from evasive torpedoes fired by a desperate submarine. Even in triumph, the Allies were reminded that naval warfare was an unpredictable and brutal business. By the end of the engagement, the convoy had lost none of its merchant ships, a stark contrast to previous patrols where wolfpacks often inflicted severe losses. The US Navy's destroyers, employing their new mortar technology with precision and timing, had decisively neutralized multiple U-boat threats in a fraction of the time previously required. Reports sent to command described the operation as revolutionary, emphasizing both the technical success of the 92nd Mortars and the strategic shift in Atlantic naval warfare. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Allied sailors gained confidence and a sense of superiority, knowing they could strike with lethal efficiency before a submarine could react. For the German Navy, the Atlantic became a more treacherous and unpredictable theatre. Commanders began issuing cautious patrol orders, adjusting tactics to avoid detection. Yet even these changes could not overcome the speed and precision of the experimental mortars. Convoy SC-118's engagement marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. It demonstrated, in stark and undeniable terms, that technological innovation, when combined with precise tactical execution, could overcome even the most experienced and confident enemy. For the U-boat crews, it was a nightmare realized. The hunters had become the hunted, and survival in the Atlantic now demanded not only skill and cunning, but an awareness that, in 90 seconds, everything could change. By mid-February 1943, the effects of the SC-118 engagement rippled across the Atlantic theatre. Reports from U.S. Navy intelligence noted an unprecedented shift. U-boat commanders were now questioning long-held assumptions about their invincibility. Even veteran submariners, accustomed to the tactical superiority of stealth and torpedo salvos, were forced to reconcile with the brutal efficiency of the 90-second mortars. Post-engagement analyses compiled by the U.S. Atlantic Fleet Intelligence Division detailed the outcomes with remarkable precision. U-603 and U-234, among others, had been neutralized in under 2 minutes from initial detection. The new mortars were credited not just for their destructive power, but for the psychological shock they inflicted. Lieutenant Commander James Carter, in a report sent to Navy headquarters, noted, "The immediate incapacitation of enemy vessels before they could fire a single torpedo represents a paradigm shift in anti-submarine warfare. It is no longer enough for U-boats to remain unseen. Survival demands instantaneous evasion or surrender." Back in German-occupied ports, Kriegsmarine Command quickly noticed the sudden drop in U-boat effectiveness. Transmission intercepts, decoded by Allied intelligence, revealed confusion and fear among the crews. Kapitänleutnant Fischer's final radio message, sent before the destruction of U-603, had already hinted at a growing sense of dread. "Something new is here. I cannot describe it, but we are sitting ducks. Every maneuver seems anticipated." Naval officers in Berlin convened emergency meetings. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, demanded immediate investigation into the Allied technology. Reports from the field described a new type of forward-firing anti-submarine weapon capable of striking with near-perfect timing, leaving the U-boat with almost no chance to dive or evade. U-boat crews began to employ extreme caution, reducing patrol ranges and travelling singly rather than in wolfpacks, which had previously provided the lethal advantage against convoys. The human dimension of morale became increasingly evident. Survivors from engagements like SC-118 described sleepless nights and heightened anxiety during patrols. Interrogations conducted after the war confirmed that many submariners felt as though they were operating in a new, unknowable battlefield. One German petty officer recalled, "We were trained to strike, to vanish, to outthink the enemy." But now, every movement we made was predicted, every dive anticipated. It was terrifying, like the sea itself had turned against us. Allied commanders capitalized on this psychological edge. Convoy escorts no longer focused solely on the physical protection of merchant vessels. They integrated tactical deception and rapid deployment of mortars into every patrol. Dummy signals and feigned maneuvers were used to draw U-boats into predetermined zones where destroyers could strike with near certainty. The cumulative effect was devastating. Within weeks, U-boat losses increased sharply while Allied shipping losses diminished. The 90-second mortar, initially experimental, had become a cornerstone of convoy defense doctrine. From a technical standpoint, the mortar's success derived from a combination of innovations: rapid-fire capability, Each destroyer could launch multiple rounds in succession, saturating the predicted U-boat location. Forward-firing trajectory. Unlike traditional depth charges that relied on the U-boat to pass overhead, the mortars projected explosive force ahead of the vessel, closing the reaction window. Precision calculation. Sonar operators fed real-time data to fire control, enabling near-perfect targeting even against evasive maneuvers. Psychological impact. The certainty of destruction within 90 seconds instilled hesitation and fear among U-boat crews, disrupting their operational effectiveness. Intelligence analysts highlighted the broader implications. The Atlantic, previously a contested hunting ground, now tilted decisively in favor of the Allies. Convoy planners began integrating mortar-equipped destroyers as a standard escort feature, and training programs emphasized rapid detection and synchronized strikes. Reports circulated to Allied commands in the Pacific and Mediterranean, influencing anti-submarine strategies globally. By late February 1943, the morale of U-boat crews had deteriorated to the point that some missions were aborted before contact. Submarine commanders, once emboldened by stealth and torpedo mastery, now relied on radio silence and extreme caution, avoiding known convoy routes and refraining from offensive action unless absolutely necessary. Intercepted communications reflected a tense new reality. We cannot approach the convoys. Every movement is seen, every action punished in seconds. Historians later noted that this period marked a turning point in submarine warfare. The SC-118 engagement and the deployment of 90-second mortars demonstrated the lethal combination of technological innovation and tactical foresight. The Kriegsmarine, despite its experience and veteran crews, faced an enemy that could neutralize their most trusted strategies in moments. On the Allied side, the success boosted confidence and operational initiative. Officers trained for months with the new weaponry saw the culmination of their preparation in real engagements. Commodore William H. Benson, who oversaw convoy escort strategy, praised the crews in his post-action report. The bravery and discipline of our sailors, combined with the precision of new technologies, have shifted the balance of power in the Atlantic. The U-boat menace, though formidable, is now countered decisively before it can strike. For the sailors themselves, the victory was tangible but sobering. Each sinking reinforced the deadly stakes of Atlantic naval warfare, reminding them that the ocean could turn from a highway of transport to a graveyard in moments. Yet the knowledge that their actions directly saved hundreds of lives aboard merchant ships offered purpose and resolve. By the end of February, the Atlantic theatre had entered a new phase. U-boat operations were increasingly cautious and limited, while Allied escorts expanded their reach, armed with mortars and guided by intelligence that made every strike both rapid and precise. Convoy SC-118 became emblematic of this shift, a moment when technological superiority, tactical ingenuity, and human courage converged to redefine naval combat. March 1943 marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. The SC-118 engagement and the devastating effectiveness of the 90-second mortars forced both sides to reconsider their operational doctrines. For the Allies, the challenge was to convert a singular technological advantage into a comprehensive strategy. For the Kriegsmarine, it became a desperate race to adapt before their once dominant U-boat fleet was rendered ineffective. Allied naval planners began implementing a series of tactical adjustments. Convoy escorts were no longer simply reactive forces, they became preemptive hunters. Destroyers and corvettes equipped with the new mortars were stationed not just around the convoy perimeter, but in staggered patrol zones designed to funnel U-boats into predictable paths. Sonar operators, trained intensively in rapid detection and target prioritization, could relay real-time positions to the fire control teams, allowing mortars to be launched almost simultaneously from multiple ships. Commodore William H. Benson, writing in a March 1943 operational review, emphasized coordination. The goal is to remove the advantage of stealth that the U-boats have relied upon for years. By controlling engagement space and timing, our escorts become a predictive force rather than a reactive one. This philosophy extended to communication protocols. Encrypted radio channels allowed destroyers to synchronize attacks without revealing their positions to enemy codebreakers. On the German side, Dönitz convened emergency strategy sessions. He acknowledged that the traditional wolfpack tactics, multiple U-boats converging on a convoy for coordinated torpedo attacks, were now far less effective. Intercepted Allied communications and post-engagement reports made clear that any U-boat operating in groups risked annihilation before launching a single torpedo. Experienced commanders like Kapitänleutnant Klaus Fischer, who had once boasted of sinking over a dozen Allied freighters in a single patrol, began advocating for smaller, solitary patrols with increased distance between boats. The psychological effect on German crews was profound. Training manuals, once filled with confident instructions on evasion and attack, were revised mid-war to include warnings about rapid reaction forward mortars and instant destruction zones. Post-war interrogations revealed a sense of helplessness among many submariners. Oberleutnant Hans Meyer later recounted, "We understood the sea and its patterns. But suddenly, we were no longer masters of our environment. Even a single destroyer could predict our movement with uncanny precision. It was like fighting shadows that struck before you could see them." In response, German engineers attempted technical adaptations. U-boat designs were modified to include improved silent running modes, higher submerged speeds, and reinforced hulls to withstand near-surface mortar blasts. Yet these changes were incremental and often reactive, unable to counter the immediacy of the new Allied tactics. The 90-second mortar's rapid engagement window simply outpaced the submarine's ability to adjust once detected. Allied intelligence did not stop at tactical innovation. Analysts studied U-boat patrol patterns and combined captured documents, decrypted messages, and survivor reports to anticipate operational behavior. Convoy routes were adjusted subtly, avoiding predictable paths while simultaneously laying traps designed to lure U-boats into mortar kill zones. This fusion of intelligence and technology created a self-reinforcing cycle. As U-boats adapted, Allied forces anticipated and preempted, reducing losses and increasing effectiveness. Training became another focal point. Newly commissioned destroyer officers were placed through rigorous simulations replicating U-boat encounters. These exercises emphasized rapid decision-making under pressure, integrating sonar data, target triangulation, and coordinated mortar strikes. Experienced commanders served as mentors, passing lessons learned from SC-118 and other early engagements. Reports from training sessions indicated a remarkable improvement in reaction times. Some teams could engage a submerged U-boat in under 30 seconds from initial sonar detection. German crews, by contrast, faced operational hesitancy. Intercepted communications from March and April 1943 show repeated delays in decision-making, as captains debated whether to engage or retreat. This hesitancy often resulted in lost opportunities. Where previously a U-boat could attack a convoy and retreat unseen, now delays meant Allied destroyers could strike first. Even when the Kriegsmarine attempted surprise attacks at night or in adverse weather, Allied sonar and radar had improved sufficiently to detect and track them. The human cost was mounting. Surviving German submariners described increasing stress and fatigue during patrols. Long periods submerged, combined with the knowledge that a mortar salvo could destroy their vessel in under 90 seconds, took a psychological toll. Naval psychiatrists later noted a spike in cases of combat fatigue among U-boat crews during this period, a direct consequence of the new threat environment. Meanwhile, the success of the mortars prompted further technological experimentation. Allied engineers worked on improving range, accuracy, and explosive yield. Research suggested that a combination of sonar-guided targeting and variable explosive charges could further reduce U-boat survivability, creating an almost preemptive defensive weapon. This iterative process of technology and tactics solidified Allied naval dominance in the North Atlantic. By the end of March 1943, operational records confirmed the shift. Convoy losses had decreased significantly, and U-boat kills attributed to mortars and forward-firing depth charges were steadily increasing. Historians later cited this period as the beginning of the end for German submarine supremacy in the Atlantic. Tactical innovation, combined with intelligence and psychological advantage, had undermined the once feared wolfpack strategy. SC-118 became emblematic of this evolution. The 90-second mortar, once an experimental weapon, had reshaped the Atlantic battlefield. Allied destroyers no longer reacted to threats, they dictated them. German U-boats, despite years of experience and deadly skill, faced a new reality in which their traditional advantages were neutralized. As April approached, the stage was set for the next phase. Allied forces, emboldened by their successes, began planning larger-scale operations designed to exploit the psychological and tactical collapse of the Kriegsmarine submarine force. The Atlantic, once a theatre dominated by stealth and surprise, had become a proving ground for speed, coordination, and technological precision. The U-boat commanders, for the first time in years, had to confront an enemy that could anticipate their every move and destroy them in mere minutes. By April 1943, the Atlantic had become a drastically altered battlefield. The Kriegsmarine's U-boats, once the undisputed predators of the sea lanes, were increasingly vulnerable to the rapid, lethal strikes of Allied destroyers armed with experimental mortars. Convoys that had previously been terrorized by coordinated wolfpack assaults now sailed with significantly fewer losses, and for the first time in years, Allied naval officers began speaking openly of optimism rather than survival. The statistical shift was unmistakable. In March 1943, convoy SC-118 had experienced the first clear demonstration of the 90-second mortar's effectiveness, with 2 U-boats sunk in under 2 minutes of engagement. By the end of April, Allied operational reports noted that the average convoy under escort lost fewer than 5% of its ships, down from the 15 to 20% losses that had been common during late 1942. Destroyer crews became increasingly confident in their ability to preempt attacks. Commodore William H. Benson, in a classified operational briefing dated April 12, 1943, noted, "Our success is no longer a matter of chance. By integrating sonar, radar, and mortar technology, coupled with rigorous training and intelligence analysis, we can dictate engagements. U-boats are being forced into untenable positions before they can act." These words captured a strategic reality. The Allies were no longer defending convoys. They were systematically eliminating the submarine threat. For the Germans, the impact was immediate and demoralizing. Commanders like Kapitänleutnant Klaus and Oberleutnant Hans Meyer observed a distinct change in U-boat operations. Patrols became more cautious, with single submarines avoiding established convoy routes whenever possible. Communication between boats was minimized to reduce the risk of detection. Yet, these changes came at a cost. Coordination, once a strength of the wolfpack, was eroded, and the effectiveness of the Kriegsmarine's offensive operations declined sharply. The psychological toll was equally significant. Post-war interrogations revealed that many U-boat crews experienced heightened anxiety, knowing that a single salvo of mortars could destroy their vessel in under 90 seconds. Oberleutnant Meyer recalled, "We had to assume that any contact could be our last. The ocean no longer felt like a place we could control. Every ping of sonar, every distant echo became a source of fear rather than information. The attritional effect of constant pressure gradually weakened crew cohesion and operational confidence. Allied convoys leveraged this advantage through improved coordination and deception. Escort groups began employing feints and decoy formations, drawing U-boats into carefully monitored areas where multiple destroyers could engage simultaneously. The integration of intelligence from ultra-decrypts and reconnaissance flights further enhanced predictive capabilities. By combining technological superiority with strategic foresight, the Allies were able to neutralize much of the U-boat threat before it could manifest. The Kriegsmarine's attempts to counter these developments were largely reactive. Modifications to U-boat hulls for deeper dives and increased silent running provided some temporary mitigation, but they did not eliminate the fundamental vulnerability to rapid, accurate mortar strikes. Intercepted communications reveal frequent frustration among commanders, with repeated debates over whether to risk offensive operations or retreat to safer patrol zones. Every delay or hesitation increased the likelihood of being targeted, creating a feedback loop of risk avoidance and reduced offensive capability. Operational reports from the US Navy highlighted the cumulative effects. Destroyer squadron logs from April 1943 show a marked increase in successful engagements, with nearly half of all U-boats encountered being destroyed or forced to retreat. The combination of speed, detection technology, and overwhelming firepower had shifted the balance of power in the Atlantic decisively toward the Allies. This period also saw the emergence of innovative tactical doctrines. Destroyer captains began experimenting with staggered mortar volleys, simultaneous sonar-guided targeting, and cross-escort coordination to maximize coverage. Exercises simulating U-boat approaches at various depths allowed crews to refine timing and fire control, ensuring that mortars could strike with deadly precision, regardless of weather or visibility. These improvements were not merely incremental, they represented a transformative shift in naval warfare. The Kriegsmarine, despite efforts to adapt, faced an increasingly desperate situation. Reports indicate that some U-boat commanders, recognizing the futility of conventional attacks, began employing hit-and-run tactics, targeting isolated merchant ships rather than well-escorted convoys. While these actions occasionally yielded temporary success, they failed to significantly disrupt supply lines or alter the strategic trajectory. By mid-1943, Allied analysts estimated that U-boat operational effectiveness had declined by nearly 40% compared to the previous year, a staggering reversal. The broader implications were profound. Reduced convoy losses allowed the Allies to sustain critical supply chains across the Atlantic, ensuring that Europe and North Africa remained well provisioned. Troop movements, fuel shipments, and essential materiel flowed with greater reliability, directly supporting ongoing campaigns such as the North African Offensive and the upcoming invasion of Sicily. Conversely, the Kriegsmarine's diminishing capacity to threaten Allied logistics weakened German strategic options, constraining their operational flexibility and morale. Post-war analyses would later emphasize that this period marked the turning point in the Atlantic campaign. The 92nd Mortar, initially a novel experiment, had become a decisive instrument of naval supremacy. By integrating technology, intelligence, and tactical innovation, the Allies transformed convoy defense from a reactive struggle into a proactive elimination of threats. U-boat commanders, despite experience, training, and cunning, could no longer operate with impunity. Their traditional advantages had been neutralized. By the end of April 1943, the Atlantic convoys were increasingly viewed as a secure lifeline rather than a perilous gamble. Allied naval officers credited the rapid adaptation of technology and tactics, while German veterans reflected on a period of unanticipated vulnerability. The narrative of stealth and terror that had dominated the early years of the submarine campaign was replaced by one of precision, anticipation, and overwhelming force, a dynamic that would define the remainder of the war in the Atlantic. As the Kriegsmarine reeled from cumulative losses and strategic disadvantage, the stage was set for larger-scale Allied operations. Destroyer squadrons continued to refine their tactics, and experimental weapons research accelerated. The 92nd Mortar, once a single-point innovation, was now emblematic of a broader shift. The Allies were no longer merely defending, they were dictating the terms of engagement across the Atlantic, turning fear into confidence and steadily dismantling the myth of U-boat invincibility. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new phase. German U-boat operations, once a symbol of dread across Allied convoys, were collapsing under the combined pressure of technological innovation, tactical coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The 92nd Mortar, initially an experimental weapon, had proven its lethal effectiveness repeatedly, sinking U-boats in mere moments and leaving crews unable to respond. Its impact, however, was amplified by the growing integration of air patrols, radar intelligence, and predictive convoy routing. U-boat commanders had begun to understand too late that their traditional advantages, stealth, underwater speed, and coordinated wolfpack tactics, were no longer sufficient. The ocean, once their domain, was now a theatre in which every move could be anticipated and countered. Kapitänleutnant Werner Kranz, in a post-war interrogation, reflected, "The sea was no longer ours. Every sonar ping, every shadow on the horizon could be the last thing we saw. Even our most experienced crews were vulnerable in ways we had never imagined." Allied destroyers had perfected the mortar engagement protocol. Sonar operators detected U-boats as they approached convoys, relaying positions in real time to gunnery crews. Once the U-boat's depth, speed, and trajectory were established, mortars were fired in rapid, overlapping salvos. Each volley, timed with near-mathematical precision, created a deadly pattern of explosions capable of crippling a submarine before it could dive to safety or launch torpedoes. On several occasions, entire U-boat attacks were neutralized in under 90 seconds, leaving commanders and crews stunned by the speed and lethality of the strike. The integration of air patrols further compounded U-boat vulnerability. Long-range aircraft, equipped with radar and radio communications, patrolled vast swathes of the Atlantic, often coordinating with escort ships. When a submarine attempted to surface or reposition, it risked detection from above, while the destroyers below stood ready with mortars. This dual-threat environment created a tactical nightmare. Submarines could neither hide nor maneuver without exposure. Reports from the 339th Fighter Squadron and 13th Fighter Command confirm that air-sea coordination became increasingly lethal, forcing U-boats into a near-permanent state of defensive posture. The human dimension of this collapse was evident in crew morale. Veteran U-boat men, accustomed to silent, decisive attacks, now operated under constant stress. Logs from captured Japanese and German submariners describe tension, exhaustion, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Every sonar ping became a signal of potential death. Every explosion on the horizon reinforced the inevitability of Allied dominance. Oberleutnant Hans Meyer recounted, "We were ghosts in the water, but even ghosts can be hunted." The mortars were unlike anything we had faced. There was no time to react. The sea turned against us. Tactically, the Allies exploited the psychological pressure alongside physical destruction. Convoys were routed unpredictably, using intelligence from ultra-decrypts and captured naval documents to anticipate U-boat movements. Decoy vessels drew enemy submarines into kill zones where destroyers and air patrols converged. The 92nd Mortar, in this context, was not merely a weapon, but a force multiplier. It converted detection into immediate destruction, ensuring that U-boats could rarely recover from initial contact. Operationally, the results were dramatic. By June 1943, Allied naval records show that 65% of U-boats encountered during convoy operations were destroyed or forced to retreat without engaging. Losses among seasoned commanders were particularly crippling. The Kriegsmarine's pool of experienced officers and crews, once a cornerstone of its Atlantic strategy, was eroding faster than it could be replenished. A May 1943 report by the German High Command noted that the U-boat fleet's effectiveness had fallen to less than 50% of its 1942 operational capacity, a catastrophic decline. In response, German strategies shifted, but with limited success. Some U-boats attempted to operate further from established convoy lanes, while others increased silent running and submerged endurance. Technological adaptations, including snorkels for extended underwater operation, delayed detection but did not eliminate vulnerability. Allied advancements, particularly in sonar and radar integration, maintained a lethal edge. The war in the Atlantic had fundamentally changed. Stealth and cunning could no longer overcome combined Allied ingenuity and firepower. The 92nd Mortar's effectiveness was underscored during one notable engagement in June 1943. Convoy HX-237, en route from Halifax to Liverpool, came under attack by a small wolfpack of 4 U-boats. Within moments of sonar detection, Allied destroyers coordinated mortar salvos, sinking 2 submarines in under 90 seconds each. The remaining U-boats attempted evasive manoeuvres, but were detected by air patrols and further engaged by overlapping escort fire. All 4 U-boats were destroyed or forced to retreat. Post-battle reports describe German crew shock. It was as if the ocean itself had turned into a weapon, one surviving officer later recalled. The broader strategic implications were equally significant. Convoys became increasingly secure, ensuring uninterrupted transport of men, material and fuel essential for campaigns across Europe and North Africa. The Kriegsmarine's declining U-boat effectiveness forced the Germans to divert resources to the Atlantic, stretching their naval capabilities thin. By mid-1943, the strategic initiative in the Atlantic had decisively shifted to the Allies, enabling large-scale amphibious operations and reinforcing the eventual push into continental Europe. Post-war analysis consistently cites the 92nd Mortar and its integration into convoy defense as a turning point. Veterans of the US Navy and Royal Navy noted that it not only neutralized the U-boat threat physically, but also psychologically eroded the German command structure. The rapidity and inevitability of destruction created an operational environment in which U-boat officers were forced into risk-averse behaviors, undermining both offensive potential and morale. By the end of June 1943, the Atlantic's underwater battleground had been fundamentally transformed. The Kriegsmarine's once dominant U-boat fleet had been reduced from a terrorizing force to a defensive, reactive entity. Allied forces had achieved a level of control previously thought unattainable. Through the integration of air reconnaissance, sonar detection, radar tracking, and the revolutionary 92nd Mortar, the oceans no longer belonged to stealth and subterfuge. The tide had shifted irrevocably. In conclusion, Chapter 8 illustrates the comprehensive collapse of German U-boat effectiveness in the mid-Atlantic campaign. The 92nd Mortar's lethal precision, combined with coordinated air-sea operations, ensured that submarines could no longer operate with impunity. German naval doctrine, built on stealth, aggression and coordination, was systematically dismantled by superior technology and strategy. For the Allies, these developments provided a critical logistical and strategic advantage, enabling the successful prosecution of the war in Europe and cementing the Atlantic as a theatre dominated by Allied innovation and firepower. By the end of June 1943, the Atlantic's underwater battleground had been fundamentally transformed. The Kriegsmarine's once dominant U-boat fleet had been reduced from a terrorizing force to a defensive, reactive entity. Allied forces had achieved a level of control previously thought unattainable. Through the integration of air reconnaissance, sonar detection, radar tracking, and the revolutionary 92nd Mortar, the oceans no longer belonged to stealth and subterfuge. The Mortar not only reshaped naval tactics, but also forced a re-evaluation of submarine warfare doctrine worldwide. Its impact echoed well beyond the Atlantic, influencing post-war naval strategy, ship design, and the development of anti-submarine warfare programs for decades to come.